Hello everyone. If you enjoy my channel, please support me with one like, one subscribe, and one share.
Why did everything feel different? Have you ever reached a point in life where nothing is technically wrong, yet something feels strangely out of place? Maybe you wake up every morning, follow the same routine, smile at the same people, and live in a comfortable home, but deep inside, there is a quiet question that refuses to leave. What exactly is missing? What is this feeling that nobody seems to talk about? And what if that feeling became stronger after moving through everyday life in America, not as a tourist, not as a newcomer chasing a dream, but simply as a woman trying to build a happy life with her husband, her children, and the people she loves? That is the question that stayed with me for years. If you have ever felt disconnected from your surroundings, misunderstood by the people closest to you, or surprised by how different life can feel even when everything appears normal, then this story may feel very familiar. It is also a story that can help you practice slow and clear English listening, reading, and speaking through real-life storytelling. My name is Emily, and this is the story of why living in America felt so different to me. When people think about life in the United States, they often imagine opportunity, freedom, modern cities, beautiful neighborhoods, and happy families gathering around large dinner tables. In many ways, those images are true. My life looked good from the outside. I had a caring husband. We lived in a quiet community. Our children were healthy and growing fast. We had neighbors who smiled when we passed by. We had weekend plans, school activities, family photos, and all the small pieces that seemed to create a normal American life. Yet there were moments when I felt like I was standing in the middle of a familiar room while somehow being completely lost. The strange part was that nothing dramatic had happened. There was no major crisis. Nobody was being cruel. Nobody was trying to hurt me. But little by little, I started noticing things that made me pause. Why did conversations feel different here? Why did people seem friendly but distant at the same time? Why did everyone appear busy, even when they were relaxing? Why did I sometimes feel lonely while sitting at a table surrounded by people I loved? At first, I thought maybe I was imagining it. After all, every country has its own culture. Every family has its own habits. Every community has its own rhythm. But the feeling continued. One afternoon, I was sitting in a local park watching parents play with their children. The weather was beautiful. The sky was clear. Families laughed around me. It should have been a perfect moment. Yet I noticed something interesting. Most people stayed within their own circles. They smiled politely at strangers. They exchanged brief greetings. Then they returned to their own worlds. Nobody was rude. In fact, everyone was incredibly respectful. But I realized there was an invisible boundary around each person. It was a kind of social distance that fascinated me. In America, I learned that friendliness and closeness are not always the same thing. That discovery may sound simple, but it changed the way I understood relationships. Psychologists often explain that human beings build trust through repeated interactions and shared experiences. A smile can create a positive first impression, but genuine connection requires time, vulnerability, and consistency. The more I observed daily life, the more I understood that many people around me valued personal space, independence, and privacy very deeply. Once I recognized this pattern, many situations suddenly made more sense. Yet understanding something and emotionally accepting it are two different challenges. Around the same time, I began noticing another difference. People often asked, "How are you?" but they did not always expect a detailed answer. The first few times this happened, I found it confusing. Someone would greet me warmly, ask how I was doing, and then continue walking before I could fully respond. Eventually, I learned that in many situations, the question was a social greeting rather than an invitation to share every detail of my day. It was not dishonesty. It was simply part of the communication style. Small discoveries like these became unexpected lessons. They taught me that understanding a culture is not about memorizing rules. It is about noticing patterns that are invisible until you live with them every day. This realization also influenced the way I practiced English. Instead of focusing only on grammar or vocabulary, I started paying attention to how people expressed emotions, solved disagreements, showed respect, and maintained friendships. Language was no longer just words. It became a window into the way people thought and lived. Research from social psychology suggests that people adapt more successfully to new environments when they learn both language and cultural context together. Looking back, I can see why. Many misunderstandings do not happen because people use the wrong words. They happen because people attach different meanings to the same words. One evening, after a family gathering, I sat alone in the kitchen long after everyone else had gone to bed. The house was quiet. The dishes were clean. The lights were dim. I should have felt content. Instead, I found myself staring out the window, asking a question I could not ignore anymore. Why does living in America feel so different? I did not know it then, but that simple question would lead me through unexpected lessons about marriage, family, friendship, loneliness, resilience, and personal growth. It would challenge assumptions I had carried for years. It would reveal hidden pressures that many families experience but rarely discuss openly. Most importantly, it would teach me that sometimes the greatest transformation does not happen when the world around us changes. It happens when we begin to understand ourselves more clearly. And the story of how I learned that lesson begins with a few ordinary moments that seemed insignificant at the time, but would soon change the way I saw my family, my relationships, and my life forever. The strange rules nobody explained. If you had asked me a few years earlier what the hardest part of everyday life would be, I probably would have mentioned something obvious. Maybe balancing work and family. Maybe raising children. Maybe handling unexpected expenses. What I would not have said was this: trying to understand rules that nobody ever explains. Yet that became one of the most surprising parts of my life in America. These were not official laws. They were not written anywhere. Nobody handed me a guidebook. But somehow everyone seemed to know them. The more I paid attention, the more I realized that many of the most important social rules were invisible. They quietly shaped conversations, friendships, marriages, neighborhoods, and even the way people viewed success. The strange thing was that I did not notice these rules all at once. They revealed themselves little by little, almost like clues in a mystery. One clue appeared during a neighborhood barbecue. Another surfaced at a school event for my children. A third emerged during a casual conversation with a friend. Each experience seemed ordinary on its own. Together, they painted a picture of a culture that was both welcoming and surprisingly complex. One Saturday afternoon, my family attended a community gathering. Children were running across the grass. Music played softly in the background. People laughed while holding paper plates filled with food. It looked exactly like the kind of event that appears in advertisements about American family life. At first, I felt comfortable. Everyone smiled. Everyone was polite. Conversations started easily. Yet after a while, I noticed something interesting. People rarely asked deeply personal questions. They discussed hobbies, local events, sports, travel plans, and school activities. But many topics remained untouched unless a close relationship had already been established. It was as if an invisible line existed around personal matters. Nobody had told me this rule. I simply observed it. Social researchers often describe American culture as highly individualistic. In simple terms, many people place strong value on personal choice, independence, and privacy. Once I understood this concept, many interactions suddenly became easier to interpret. What initially felt like distance was often respect. What seemed like emotional restraint was sometimes consideration. People were not avoiding connection. They were waiting until trust naturally developed. That realization helped me avoid a mistake many people make when entering unfamiliar social environments. Assuming that different automatically means unfriendly. Another invisible rule appeared in a place I visited almost every week, the grocery store. One day, I was standing in line waiting to pay. The cashier greeted each customer warmly. "How's your day going?" she asked. Every person smiled and replied with a short answer. Nobody shared a detailed story. Nobody explained their problems. The interaction moved smoothly and efficiently. Watching this exchange repeatedly taught me something important. In many situations, communication in America values positivity and brevity. This does not mean people lack depth. It simply means that context matters. There is a time for casual conversation and a time for personal discussion. Understanding that distinction changed the way I interacted with people. Ironically, it also improved my English. Instead of memorizing endless vocabulary lists, I started paying attention to real conversations. I listened to tone, timing, and social cues. Language became connected to human behavior. According to studies in language acquisition, learners often make faster progress when they focus on meaningful communication rather than isolated grammar exercises. Looking back, I can see why this approach helped me so much. The words themselves were only part of the message. The cultural context carried the rest. Around this time, another lesson emerged inside my own home. One evening, after dinner, my husband and I found ourselves discussing weekend plans. The conversation seemed simple enough. I expected us to make decisions together by discussing every possibility. Instead, he approached the situation differently. He immediately focused on practical solutions and individual preferences. Neither approach was wrong. We simply viewed decision-making through different cultural lenses. What fascinated me was how often these small misunderstandings occurred. Not because either of us lacked good intentions, but because we interpreted situations differently. Relationship experts frequently note that successful marriages depend less on avoiding conflict and more on understanding how each partner processes information and emotions. That insight became increasingly important as our family life grew busier. The invisible rules did not stop at communication. They appeared in parenting as well. At school events, I noticed many parents encouraging independence from a very young age. Children were often invited to express opinions, make choices, and develop confidence through participation. Initially, I found some of these practices surprising. Over time, however, I began appreciating the reasoning behind them. The goal was not simply raising obedient children. The goal was helping them become capable adults. Once again, nobody sat me down and explained this philosophy. I learned it through observation, conversations, and experience. Yet perhaps the most surprising invisible rule involved time. Americans often speak about being busy. At first, I assumed this was an exaggeration. Then I looked more closely. Calendars filled weeks in advance. Family activities, appointments, work obligations, school responsibilities, and social commitments competed for attention. Efficiency was highly valued. Time itself seemed to carry a different weight. This helped explain why many interactions felt brief even when people genuinely cared about one another. It was not necessarily a lack of interest. Often, it was a reflection of competing priorities. As months passed, these discoveries gradually changed the way I viewed life around me. Instead of judging differences, I became curious about them. Curiosity opened doors that assumptions would have kept closed. More importantly, it revealed a truth I had not expected. Many of the frustrations people experience are not caused by bad intentions. They arise because different people follow different invisible rules. Once we recognize those rules, confusion begins to fade. Yet just as I started feeling more confident about understanding the culture around me, a challenge emerged much closer to home. It was not about neighbors, schools, or casual conversations. It was about my marriage. A series of small misunderstandings that seemed harmless at first were quietly building beneath the surface. Neither of us noticed how much tension was accumulating. Neither of us realized that our assumptions about communication, expectations, and emotional support were heading toward a collision. And when that collision finally arrived, it forced me to confront a question far more personal than anything I had faced before. What happens when the invisible rules you never learned begin affecting the person you love most? Smiles, distance, and reality. A smile can be one of the most confusing things in the world. Think about it for a moment. A smile can mean welcome, kindness, happiness, politeness, nervousness, or even a desire to end a conversation quickly. The strange part is that two people can see the exact same smile and understand completely different messages. I did not fully appreciate this until I began paying closer attention to everyday life around me. By then, I had already started noticing the invisible social rules that shaped so many interactions in America. I thought I was beginning to understand how things worked. Then reality surprised me again. The lesson arrived through a series of ordinary moments that seemed unrelated at first. Looking back, however, those moments changed the way I viewed friendship, community, marriage, and even loneliness. One morning, while walking through my neighborhood, I passed several people. Almost every person smiled. Some waved. Others greeted me with a cheerful good morning. The atmosphere felt warm and welcoming. Yet weeks later, I realized that despite all those friendly interactions, I barely knew any of them beyond their names. We exchanged smiles regularly, but our lives remained separate. At first, this confused me. How could people seem so friendly while still maintaining such clear boundaries? The question stayed in my mind longer than I expected. The answer began to emerge during a conversation with a neighbor named Sarah. We often spoke while collecting our mail. One afternoon, after months of brief conversations about weather, gardening, and neighborhood events, I finally asked her if she would like to have coffee sometime. She smiled and happily agreed. During that coffee meeting, something interesting happened. For the first time, our conversation moved beyond surface topics. We talked about family challenges, personal goals, fears, and dreams. As we spoke, I suddenly understood something important. The smiles had always been genuine. The friendliness had always been real. But deeper connection required time and trust. In many cases, people did not assume instant closeness. They allowed relationships to develop gradually. Psychologists often describe trust as a process rather than an event. Research suggests that meaningful friendships usually grow through repeated positive interactions over time. When I learned this, many experiences suddenly made more sense. What I had once interpreted as emotional distance was often simply a different approach to building relationships. Yet understanding this idea intellectually did not completely eliminate the emotional challenges. There were still moments when I felt disconnected. There were evenings when the house became quiet after a long day. My husband would be reading. The children would be focused on homework or activities. Everything appeared peaceful. Yet sometimes I experienced a feeling I struggled to explain. It was not sadness. It was not unhappiness. It was more like a sense of standing between two worlds. Surrounded by people, yet somehow feeling alone. Surprisingly, studies show that this experience is more common than many people realize. Researchers have found that loneliness is not determined simply by the number of people around us. Instead, it often relates to the quality of our connections and our sense of belonging. A person can live in a crowded city and feel isolated. Another can spend much of the day alone and still feel deeply connected. The difference lies in meaningful relationships, emotional understanding, and shared experiences. These findings fascinated me because they matched what I was beginning to observe in my own life. Around this time, I started noticing another pattern. Many people around me appeared successful and confident. Their social media profiles showed vacations, celebrations, achievements, and smiling family photos. Yet when conversations became more personal, a different reality sometimes emerged. Behind those polished images were worries about work, marriage, finances, parenting, health, and the future. In other words, many people carried struggles that were invisible to outsiders. This realization was strangely comforting. Not because others faced difficulties, but because it reminded me that nobody's life is as simple as it appears from a distance. One evening, my husband and I attended a community event. As usual, people were friendly. Conversations flowed easily. Laughter filled the room. Yet on the drive home, I asked him a question that had been sitting in my mind for weeks. Do you ever feel like everyone looks connected, but many people are actually lonely? He was quiet for a moment before answering. Then he said something I have never forgotten. I think a lot of people are waiting for someone else to take the first step. That sentence stayed with me. The more I thought about it, the more it explained what I was seeing. Many people wanted connection. Many people wanted friendship. Many people wanted deeper conversations. But fear, busyness, uncertainty, and habit often kept everyone safely on the surface. Nobody intended to create distance. It simply happened. Inspired by that realization, I decided to experiment. I began initiating more conversations. I invited neighbors for coffee. I attended local events more regularly. I followed up with people after meeting them. None of these actions were dramatic. Yet the results surprised me. Gradually, relationships deepened. Familiar faces became friends. Casual conversations became meaningful discussions. The world around me did not suddenly change. My participation in it changed. This experience also influenced the way I practiced English. Instead of worrying about making every sentence perfect, I focused on genuine communication. I discovered that people rarely remembered minor language mistakes. They remembered kindness, interest, humor, and authenticity. This insight removed a great deal of pressure. According to communication experts, confidence often grows through action rather than preparation alone. Waiting until we feel completely ready can become a trap. Progress usually begins when we participate despite imperfection. Looking back now, I realize that many of my assumptions about life in America were incomplete. The smiles were real. The friendliness was genuine. But relationships often developed differently than I expected. Understanding that difference helped me feel less confused and more connected. However, just as I was becoming more comfortable navigating these social dynamics, a much more personal challenge was quietly developing inside my own home. It did not involve neighbors or friendships. It involved my marriage. Small misunderstandings that once seemed harmless were becoming more frequent. Expectations were beginning to clash. Stress was increasing. Neither of us intended to create tension, yet somehow it was growing anyway. And before long, I would find myself facing a question far more difficult than understanding cultural differences. Why did the person I loved most suddenly feel harder to understand than everyone else around me? Marriage felt different here. Have you ever noticed how two people can live in the same house, eat at the same table, sleep under the same roof, and still slowly begin speaking two completely different emotional languages? It sounds impossible at first. After all, marriage is supposed to bring people closer together. Yet one of the most surprising lessons I learned while living in America was that closeness does not happen automatically. In fact, the busier life becomes, the easier it is for two people to drift apart without even realizing it. The strange part is that this process rarely begins with a major argument. It usually starts with small moments so ordinary that they seem unimportant. A conversation cut short because someone is tired. A concern that goes unspoken because it feels too small to mention. A misunderstanding that gets ignored because neither person wants conflict. Looking back, I can now see those moments clearly. At the time, however, they felt like nothing more than normal life. My husband and I genuinely loved each other. We were raising our children together. We shared responsibilities, solved problems, paid bills, attended school events, and managed all the daily tasks that come with family life. From the outside, everything looked stable. Friends often described us as a happy couple. Family members assumed everything was going well. Even I believed that most of the time. Yet beneath the surface, subtle differences in expectations were beginning to create tension. What made the situation confusing was that neither of us was intentionally doing anything wrong. We simply viewed certain aspects of life differently. One evening provides a perfect example. After dinner, I wanted to sit and talk about how the week had gone. I wanted to discuss the children's activities, future plans, and some concerns that had been on my mind. My husband listened for a few minutes, then immediately started offering solutions. At first glance, that sounds helpful. In many situations, it is. But what I wanted most at that moment was not a solution. I wanted understanding. I wanted someone to listen before trying to fix anything. He, on the other hand, believed he was being supportive by helping solve the problem. neither of us recognized the misunderstanding unfolding between us. Relationship researchers have studied this dynamic for decades. One recurring finding is that many conflicts are not caused by disagreement itself. They are caused by different expectations about communication. One person may seek emotional connection. Another may focus on practical problem solving. Both intentions can be positive, yet frustration develops when those needs fail to align. Once I learned about this research, I began recognizing similar patterns in our marriage. The realization was eye-opening. Suddenly, many of our previous disagreements looked different. They were not battles between right and wrong. They were collisions between two perspectives. Around the same time, I noticed another aspect of life in America that influenced our relationship. Independence is highly valued in many parts of American culture. People are often encouraged to be self-reliant, pursue personal goals, and maintain individual identities. These values offer many benefits. They can foster confidence, ambition, and resilience. However, they can also create unexpected challenges within a marriage. There were times when both of us became so focused on responsibilities that we unintentionally stopped sharing parts of our inner worlds. We were functioning as a team, yet sometimes neglecting the emotional connection that had brought us together in the first place. One Saturday morning, I experienced a moment that forced me to pay attention. My husband was working on a project in the garage. The children were busy with their activities. I was cleaning the kitchen when an unusual thought entered my mind. I suddenly realized I could describe everyone's schedules perfectly, but I was less certain about what they had been feeling lately. That realization unsettled me. How had I become so informed about logistics while knowing less about emotions? The question lingered for days. Eventually, I started observing families around me more carefully. To my surprise, I discovered that many couples faced similar challenges. Conversations with friends revealed a common theme. Life moved fast. Responsibilities multiplied. Time felt limited. People loved each other deeply, yet often struggled to create meaningful space for connection. Studies conducted by family psychologists support these observations. Research consistently shows that relationship satisfaction is strongly influenced by small daily interactions rather than grand romantic gestures. Brief conversations, expressions of appreciation, shared experiences, and emotional attentiveness often matter more than dramatic displays of affection. This finding fascinated me because it challenged a popular myth. Many people believe strong relationships are built through extraordinary moments. In reality, they are often built through ordinary moments repeated consistently over time. Inspired by this insight, I decided to experiment with small changes. Instead of waiting for the perfect opportunity to connect, I began creating simple opportunities. A longer conversation during a walk. A question asked without distractions. A few extra minutes at the end of the day devoted entirely to listening. The changes seemed minor. Yet their impact surprised me. Gradually, our conversations became more open. We started sharing thoughts that previously remained unspoken. We laughed more. We understood each other better. The relationship itself had not been broken. It had simply needed attention. Still, progress did not eliminate every challenge. In fact, just as things appeared to be improving, an unexpected situation tested us in ways neither of us anticipated. It began with a misunderstanding so small that most people would have dismissed it immediately. A forgotten conversation. A missed expectation. a simple assumption made by both sides. Under normal circumstances, it would have passed quickly. But this time was different. Stress from work, parenting responsibilities, and everyday pressures had quietly accumulated beneath the surface. The misunderstanding became a spark landing on dry ground. What followed would force both of us to confront uncomfortable truths about communication, expectations, and emotional needs. More importantly, it would lead to one of the most difficult nights of our marriage, a night that would leave me questioning whether we had truly been listening to each other at all. The night we almost gave up. Some of the most important moments in life do not announce themselves when they arrive. There are no warning signs flashing in the sky. No dramatic music playing in the background. No voice whispering that everything is about to change. Instead, those moments often begin on completely ordinary days. That is exactly what happened on the night my husband and I almost gave up on truly understanding each other. Looking back now, I can see that the problem was never a single argument. It was something far more dangerous because it was nearly invisible. It was the slow accumulation of assumptions, unspoken expectations, exhaustion, and emotional distance that had quietly grown over time. Like dust gathering on a window, it happened so gradually that neither of us noticed how much clarity we had lost. The day itself started normally. The children had school activities. My husband had a demanding schedule. I spent most of the day balancing responsibilities at home while managing several tasks that seemed to multiply every hour. By evening, everyone was tired. If you have ever lived through a busy season of family life, you probably know the feeling. The house appears calm on the outside, but internally everyone is running on low energy. Psychologists sometimes describe this state as cognitive overload. When stress accumulates, the brain becomes less patient, less flexible, and more likely to interpret neutral situations negatively. In simple terms, tired people often hear criticism where none was intended. Unfortunately, that evening became a perfect example. The disagreement began with something small. In fact, it was so small that I can barely remember the original issue. It involved a conversation we thought we had already had regarding plans for the following week. I believed one thing had been decided. My husband believed something entirely different. At first, the confusion seemed harmless. Then frustration entered the conversation. Then defensiveness followed. Within minutes, we were no longer discussing schedules. We were discussing feelings. Or more accurately, we were arguing because we had not been discussing feelings. The strange thing about relationship conflicts is that they often disguise themselves. People argue about dishes, schedules, finances, text messages, forgotten errands, or missed appointments. Yet beneath those surface topics usually lies a deeper emotional concern. Am I being heard? Am I appreciated? Do I matter? Do you understand what I am carrying every day? That night, those hidden questions suddenly rose to the surface. For the first time in a long while, neither of us focused on solving the problem. Instead, we focused on defending ourselves. Every explanation sounded like an accusation. Every response sounded like criticism. The conversation became a competition that nobody could win. Researchers who study marriage have identified a fascinating pattern. During conflict, people often stop listening in order to understand and begin listening in order to respond. When that happens, communication breaks down rapidly. Looking back, I can see exactly when that shift occurred. We were hearing words but missing meanings. We were reacting to sentences without understanding emotions. At one point, the room became completely silent. The argument had exhausted itself. Neither of us knew what to say next. The silence felt heavier than the disagreement itself. I remember sitting there wondering how two people who genuinely cared about each other could suddenly feel so far apart. It was a painful realization because I knew we were not enemies. We were partners. Yet in that moment, partnership felt distant. What happened next surprised me. Instead of continuing the argument, my husband quietly asked a question. It was not a defensive question. It was not a sarcastic question. It was a sincere question. He asked, when was the last time we really talked without trying to solve something? The room became silent again. This time, however, the silence felt different. His question exposed something we had both overlooked. Almost every conversation recently had revolved around responsibilities. Work schedules. Children's activities. Household tasks. Financial decisions. Appointments. Deadlines. Problems. Solutions. Logistics. We had become highly effective managers of family life. Yet somewhere along the way, we had stopped being curious about each other's inner experiences. That realization was uncomfortable because it was true. Studies on long-term relationships consistently show that emotional intimacy depends heavily on curiosity. Couples who continue asking questions, exploring each other's thoughts, and sharing evolving experiences often maintain stronger connections over time. In contrast, many people slowly assume they already know everything about their partner. Once curiosity disappears, emotional distance often follows. That night, I understood this principle in a way no research article could ever teach. Real life had become the lesson. Instead of continuing the argument, we began talking honestly. Not about schedules. Not about tasks. Not about who was right. We talked about stress. We talked about fears. We talked about feeling overwhelmed. We talked about the pressure of trying to be good parents while managing countless responsibilities. Most importantly, we admitted something neither of us had said aloud before. We were both struggling more than the other person realized. That admission changed everything. Suddenly, the conflict no longer felt like a battle between two opposing sides. It became a shared challenge facing one family. The difference was subtle but powerful. Researchers often describe this shift as moving from adversarial thinking to collaborative thinking. Instead of asking, "How do I win?" people begin asking, "How do we solve this together?" The emotional atmosphere changes immediately. As the conversation continued, I noticed something remarkable. The anger that had seemed so intense earlier began fading. Not because the problems disappeared, but because understanding replaced assumption. Empathy replaced defensiveness. Listening replaced reacting. By the end of the evening, nothing magical had happened. Our responsibilities were still waiting for us the next morning. Life had not suddenly become easier. Yet something important had changed. We remembered that we were on the same team. We remembered why we had chosen each other in the first place. We remembered that relationships are not strengthened during easy seasons. They are strengthened when people choose connection despite difficulty. I went to bed that night feeling emotionally exhausted but strangely hopeful. The crisis had passed, but the experience left me with a new question. If one misunderstanding could reveal so much about our relationship, what other lessons were hiding inside everyday family life? At the time, I did not realize that one of the biggest answers would arrive through our children. They were about to teach me something unexpected about family, communication, and the deeper meaning of success in America, something that would completely change the way I viewed happiness itself. Lessons from raising children. If someone had asked me years ago where I would learn the most important lessons about life in America, I probably would have mentioned books, work experiences, community events, or conversations with adults. I never would have guessed that some of the most powerful lessons would come from watching my own children grow up. Children have a remarkable ability to expose truths that adults often overlook. They ask simple questions that reveal complicated realities. They notice inconsistencies. They challenge assumptions. And sometimes, without realizing it, they become mirrors reflecting parts of ourselves we rarely examine. As our children grew older, I began noticing that family life was teaching me far more than parenting skills. It was teaching me about culture, communication, relationships, resilience, and what truly matters when building a meaningful life. One afternoon, my youngest child came home from school unusually quiet. Normally, the moment the front door opened, there would be stories, questions, and endless energy. That day was different. After a few gentle questions, I learned that a disagreement with a friend had left them feeling hurt. Like many parents, my first instinct was to fix the situation immediately. I wanted to offer advice, explain what to do next, and make the discomfort disappear. Then I remembered something I had learned during that difficult conversation with my husband. Sometimes people need understanding before they need solutions. So instead of rushing to solve the problem, I listened. We sat together at the kitchen table while my child explained what had happened. The more I listened, the more I realized that the details of the disagreement were not the most important part. What mattered was the feeling behind it. My child wanted to feel heard. Strangely enough, that need is not very different from what adults want. Researchers in developmental psychology have repeatedly found that emotional validation plays a critical role in building confidence, trust, and resilience in children. In simple terms, people of all ages cope better with challenges when they feel understood. That afternoon became a reminder that effective communication is often less about speaking and more about listening. Yet that was only the beginning of what my children would teach me. Over time, I noticed another aspect of American family life that fascinated me. Schools frequently encouraged children to express opinions, ask questions, and participate actively in discussions. At first, I found this approach surprising. Many adults grew up believing that children should primarily listen rather than contribute. Yet here, curiosity was often celebrated. Students were encouraged to think independently and explain their reasoning. Watching this process unfold gave me a new perspective. The goal was not simply academic success. The goal was helping children develop confidence in their ability to think, communicate, and solve problems. Educational research strongly supports this approach. Studies suggest that children who are encouraged to ask questions often develop stronger critical thinking skills and greater confidence when facing unfamiliar situations. The more I observed, the more I appreciated the long-term value of these practices. Around the same time, another lesson emerged, and it came from a moment that initially seemed insignificant. One evening during dinner, our family began discussing future goals. The conversation moved from school projects to hobbies and dreams. I expected answers about careers or achievements. Instead, one of my children said something unexpected. "I just want to be happy." The simplicity of that statement stayed with me. Adults spend enormous amounts of time discussing success. We talk about income, accomplishments, productivity, and goals. Yet children often view life through a different lens. Their priorities can reveal truths that become buried beneath adult responsibilities. That dinner conversation sparked a question I could not ignore. How much of my daily effort was actually connected to happiness, and how much was connected to expectations? The question became even more relevant as I looked around at life in America. Many families worked incredibly hard. Schedules were packed. Calendars filled quickly. Parents balanced careers, activities, financial responsibilities, and countless obligations. There was much to admire about that dedication. Yet there were also moments when busyness seemed to become a lifestyle rather than a necessity. Researchers studying well-being have found that beyond a certain point, increased activity does not always lead to increased satisfaction. In fact, meaningful relationships, a sense of purpose, physical health, and emotional connection consistently rank among the strongest predictors of long-term happiness. Hearing this research was interesting. Watching its truth unfold inside my own family was unforgettable. One weekend, we decided to spend an entire day together without focusing on productivity. No major plans. No packed schedule. No pressure to accomplish anything impressive. We went for a walk, shared meals, talked, laughed, and simply enjoyed each other's company. At the end of the day, I realized something surprising. The memories we discussed most often as a family rarely involved expensive experiences or major achievements. They involved moments of connection. A funny conversation. A shared challenge. A spontaneous adventure. A simple evening together. This realization gradually changed the way I viewed success. It also changed the way I viewed parenting. Instead of focusing exclusively on preparing children for future accomplishments, I became more interested in helping them build emotional skills that would serve them throughout life. Resilience, empathy, communication, adaptability, gratitude. Psychological studies consistently show that these qualities contribute significantly to long-term well-being. Yet they are often developed through everyday experiences rather than formal instruction. The more I reflected on these lessons, the more I understood that raising children was not a one-way process. Parents teach children, of course. But children teach parents too. They remind us to stay curious. They challenge our assumptions. They expose our inconsistencies. They encourage us to see familiar situations through fresh eyes. Most importantly, they reveal what we truly value when nobody is watching. As our family continued navigating daily life, I felt increasingly grateful for these insights. Yet another challenge was quietly approaching. Unlike previous lessons, this one would not arrive through conversations around the dinner table or observations at school events. It would emerge from something many people rarely discuss openly. It involved stress, pressure, and the hidden emotional weight carried by countless families. From the outside, everything still looked stable. But beneath the surface, forces were building that would soon test our family in ways we never expected. And when that pressure finally revealed itself, I would discover that some of the hardest struggles in life are the ones nobody can see. The hidden pressure of everyday life. Imagine carrying a backpack every single day. At first, it feels light. You barely notice it. Then, without realizing it, someone quietly adds a small stone. A week later, another stone appears. Then another. Then another. None of them seem heavy enough to matter on their own. Yet one day you stop and wonder why your shoulders hurt. Why walking feels harder. Why your energy disappears faster than it used to. The truth is simple. The weight was accumulating long before you noticed it. That is exactly how hidden pressure often works in everyday life. It rarely arrives all at once. It builds slowly, silently, and patiently. By the time people recognize it, they are often carrying far more than they realize. For a long time, I believed stress came from major events. Financial emergencies. Health problems. Family crises. Unexpected losses. Those situations certainly create pressure, but I eventually discovered that many of the most powerful sources of stress are far less dramatic. They hide inside ordinary routines. They wear familiar faces. They disguise themselves as normal responsibilities. And because they look so ordinary, they are easy to ignore. Looking back, I can see how this process unfolded in my own family. From the outside, life seemed stable. The children were growing. My husband and I were managing our responsibilities. We had a home, routines, and goals. Nothing appeared seriously wrong. Yet there were subtle signs that something deeper was happening beneath the surface. The first sign was fatigue. Not ordinary tiredness after a busy day. This was different. It was the kind of exhaustion that sleep alone did not seem to fix. I noticed it in myself first. Small tasks felt more difficult. Decisions required more effort. My patience disappeared faster than usual. Then I began noticing similar patterns in people around me. Friends described feeling overwhelmed despite accomplishing everything they were supposed to accomplish. Parents joked about being exhausted all the time. Coworkers talked about needing breaks they never seemed able to take. The conversations were often lighthearted, but beneath the humor was something more serious. Researchers have spent years studying this phenomenon. Many psychologists describe modern stress as cumulative rather than catastrophic. In other words, people are often affected more by constant low-level pressure than by occasional major events. Deadlines. Notifications. Responsibilities. Appointments. Expectations. These factors may seem manageable individually. Together, however, they create a significant emotional burden. Once I understood this concept, I began seeing evidence everywhere. One evening, I found myself rushing through dinner because there were still emails to answer, school forms to complete, and plans to organize for the following day. As I looked around the table, I noticed something troubling. Everyone was physically present, but mentally somewhere else. My husband was thinking about work. One child was focused on an upcoming assignment. Another was worried about an activity scheduled later that week. I was mentally reviewing my endless list of unfinished tasks. We were sharing a meal together, yet our attention was scattered across multiple futures. That realization stayed with me. How often were we actually experiencing the present moment? Studies in cognitive psychology suggest that the human brain frequently operates in what researchers call future-oriented thinking. This ability helps people plan and solve problems, but excessive future focus can also increase anxiety and reduce enjoyment of daily experiences. In simple terms, people sometimes become so busy preparing for life that they forget to live it. The more I reflected on this idea, the more relevant it seemed. Another source of hidden pressure involved comparison. This one was particularly difficult because it often appeared harmless. Social media, community conversations, success stories, and public achievements constantly surrounded us. On the surface, these things could be inspiring. Yet they also created opportunities for comparison. Someone else's career appeared more successful. Someone else's family seemed more organized. Someone else's life looked easier. Of course, most people understand intellectually that public images rarely tell the full story. Yet emotional reactions do not always follow logic. Research consistently shows that frequent social comparison can contribute to dissatisfaction, stress, and feelings of inadequacy. What fascinated me was how quietly this process operated. People rarely announced that they were comparing themselves to others. Often they did not even realize they were doing it. Yet the emotional effects remained real. Around this time, I experienced a conversation that changed my perspective completely. I met a woman at a local community event. From the outside, her life appeared nearly perfect. She was successful, confident, and widely admired. During our conversation, however, she shared something unexpected. She admitted feeling overwhelmed, uncertain, and exhausted. Her honesty caught me off guard because it contradicted the image many people associated with her. Afterward, I reflected on what she had said. It reminded me that every person carries private challenges invisible to outsiders. The polished version of life people present publicly is rarely the entire story. That lesson became increasingly important. It encouraged me to replace comparison with curiosity. Instead of assuming I understood someone's life based on appearances, I became more interested in understanding their actual experiences. This shift changed many of my interactions. It also reduced a surprising amount of stress. Psychologists often note that self-compassion can improve emotional resilience. Part of self-compassion involves recognizing that struggle is a normal part of being human. Nobody escapes difficulty. Nobody has everything perfectly organized. Nobody remains confident and energetic every day. Accepting this reality can be surprisingly liberating. Yet despite these insights, hidden pressure continued affecting our family in subtle ways. We were functioning well, but I sensed that something needed to change. The pace of life was creating distance between what we valued and how we spent our time. One afternoon, a completely unexpected event forced me to confront this issue directly. It seemed insignificant at first. In fact, most people probably would have forgotten it by the following day. But for me, it became a turning point. It exposed a blind spot I had carried for years. More importantly, it revealed that many of the difficulties I blamed on circumstances were actually connected to the way I viewed those circumstances. That realization would soon transform not only how I approached stress, but how I approached life itself. And it all began with a single moment that made me stop, look around, and ask a question I had never seriously considered before. The day my thinking changed. Have you ever experienced a moment so ordinary that you almost ignored it, only to realize later that it quietly changed the direction of your life? Most people expect transformation to arrive through dramatic events. They imagine life-changing conversations, major victories, or unforgettable crises. Yet many of the deepest changes begin in much smaller ways. A sentence. A question. A brief observation. Something that slips into your mind and refuses to leave. For me, that moment arrived on an otherwise ordinary afternoon. There was no special occasion. No major family event. No dramatic turning point. The children were busy with their activities. My husband was handling his usual responsibilities. I was running errands and moving through the familiar rhythm of daily life. Everything looked completely normal. Yet by the end of that day, I would begin seeing my life, my family, and even my challenges through a completely different lens. It started while I was waiting in line at a local coffee shop. The line moved slowly, giving me plenty of time to observe the people around me. A woman standing nearby accidentally dropped a stack of papers. Several strangers immediately stepped forward to help gather them. The entire interaction lasted less than a minute. The woman thanked everyone. People smiled and returned to their own business. Nothing remarkable happened. At least that was my first impression. Then a thought entered my mind. Why had that simple moment affected me so strongly? The answer surprised me. For weeks, maybe even months, I had been focusing almost entirely on problems. Not major problems, but constant small frustrations. Busy schedules. Responsibilities. Misunderstandings. Pressure. Stress. Endless tasks. My attention had become trained to notice what was difficult. Yet in that coffee shop, I had witnessed something equally real, kindness. It occurred naturally. Quietly. Without recognition. Without reward. And I realized something uncomfortable. How many positive moments had I been overlooking simply because I was too focused on what was wrong? This question led me down a fascinating path. Later that evening, I began reading about attention and perception. Cognitive psychologists have discovered that the human brain naturally pays more attention to negative information than positive information. This tendency is often called negativity bias. Thousands of years ago, this trait helped human beings survive by quickly identifying potential dangers. In modern life, however, the same mechanism can create unexpected problems. People may become so focused on threats, mistakes, frustrations, and challenges that they fail to notice positive experiences happening around them every day. Learning about negativity bias felt like discovering a hidden instruction manual for the human mind. Suddenly, many things made sense. I began realizing that my emotional experience was influenced not only by circumstances but also by what I consistently paid attention to. The insight was both empowering and unsettling. Empowering because it suggested I had more influence over my perspective than I realized. Unsettling because it meant I could no longer blame everything on external conditions. The following week, I decided to conduct a simple experiment. Each evening before going to bed, I would write down 3 positive moments from the day. Nothing extraordinary. No pressure to find amazing experiences. Just 3 good things. The first night felt surprisingly difficult. My mind immediately searched for unfinished tasks, worries, and responsibilities. Yet after a few minutes, I identified 3 positive moments. A meaningful conversation with one of my children. A funny joke shared during dinner. A kind message from a friend. The next evening, I repeated the exercise. Then again. Then again. Within a few weeks, something unexpected happened. The positive moments became easier to notice. Not because life had suddenly improved, but because my attention had changed. Research supports this phenomenon. Studies in positive psychology suggest that intentionally recognizing positive experiences can improve emotional well-being, increase resilience, and reduce stress. The goal is not to ignore problems or pretend everything is perfect. Instead, it involves creating a more balanced perspective. Problems deserve attention, but they do not deserve all of it. Around this time, another realization emerged. I began noticing how often I described situations using fixed conclusions rather than curious questions. For example, if something went wrong, I might think, "This situation is terrible." But what if a better question was, "What can the situation teach me?" The difference seemed subtle. In reality, it changed everything. Fixed conclusions tend to close possibilities. Curious questions open them. Educational researchers have long observed that curiosity enhances learning, problem-solving, and adaptability. Curious people often tolerate uncertainty better because they view challenges as opportunities to gather information rather than evidence of failure. Once I understood this principle, I began applying it throughout daily life. A disagreement became an opportunity to learn about communication. A stressful situation became a chance to practice patience. A mistake became useful feedback rather than a personal defeat. This shift did not eliminate difficulties, but it transformed my relationship with them. The most powerful example occurred within my own family. One evening, after a particularly busy week, we gathered together for dinner. Normally, the conversation would have focused on schedules, responsibilities, and upcoming plans. Instead, I asked a simple question. What was the best part of your week? The answers were fascinating. None of them involved major achievements. Nobody mentioned grades, accomplishments, or productivity. Instead, the responses centered around connection. Time spent together. A funny moment. A shared experience. A small act of kindness. Listening to those answers revealed something important. Happiness often hides inside ordinary moments. Yet many people spend so much time chasing extraordinary experiences that they overlook the ones already available. This realization became one of the most valuable lessons I learned while living in America. The difference I had been searching for was not always located in cultural norms, social expectations, or external circumstances. Sometimes it was hidden inside my own perspective. Once I began recognizing that truth, life started feeling different. Not easier. Not perfect. But clearer. More meaningful. More intentional. However, just as I was learning to approach life with a healthier perspective, another challenge emerged. This one would involve practical changes rather than philosophical insights. It would require action, consistency, and discipline. Most importantly, it would reveal how a handful of small daily habits could completely transform the atmosphere inside a family. And the results would be far greater than I ever imagined. Small changes, big results. Most people underestimate the power of small changes because small changes are not exciting. They do not make headlines. They do not create dramatic before and after photographs. They do not produce instant results. In fact, they often feel almost invisible. Yet if there is one lesson that completely transformed my family life, my marriage, and my experience of living in America, it is this. The smallest habits often create the biggest results over time. The challenge is that human beings are naturally drawn toward dramatic solutions. When life feels overwhelming, we want major breakthroughs. We want one powerful decision that suddenly fixes everything. We imagine that happiness, connection, confidence, or success will arrive through a single life-changing event. Reality is usually much less dramatic and far more interesting. Real transformation often begins with tiny actions repeated consistently. I discovered this truth almost by accident. After the shift in perspective that began changing how I viewed daily life, I realized something important. Understanding a problem is valuable, but understanding alone rarely changes behavior. Awareness creates possibility. Action creates results. The question became simple: what practical habits could help my family feel more connected, less stressed, and more present in everyday life? I did not start with anything complicated. In fact, the first change seemed almost too small to matter. Every evening, we began spending a few minutes talking without phones, television, or distractions. That was it. No complicated family program. Conversations became deeper. People shared more. Small concerns surfaced before they became large problems. Laughter appeared more often. Looking back, the change seems obvious. Communication improves when people actually communicate. Yet many families unintentionally allow distractions to replace connection. Research consistently supports this observation. Studies on family relationships suggest that quality attention often matters more than quantity alone. A short period of focused interaction can strengthen relationships more effectively than hours spent together without meaningful engagement. Encouraged by this result, I started looking for other small adjustments. One habit involved gratitude. I know gratitude sounds simple, perhaps even predictable. I used to think the same thing. Once or twice a week during dinner, we began sharing something we appreciated. Sometimes the answers were serious. Sometimes they were funny. Sometimes they were surprisingly emotional. Over time, however, a pattern emerged. People started noticing positive things more frequently. Not because life had become perfect, but because attention influences perception. Neuroscientists have found that repeated focus shapes neural pathways in the brain. In practical terms, what we repeatedly notice becomes easier to notice again. Gratitude does not erase problems. It helps prevent problems from becoming the only thing we see. Another small habit produced an even bigger surprise. My husband and I began asking each other one simple question several times each week. How are you really doing? The version that requires listening. Initially, these conversations felt unusual because life had trained us to discuss logistics, schedules, responsibilities, tasks, plans. Gradually, however, the question created space for something deeper. We talked about stress before it became frustration. We discussed concerns before they became arguments. We shared victories that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. Relationship experts often describe emotional intimacy as a product of ongoing curiosity. The strongest relationships are not necessarily those without conflict. They are often those in which people continue learning about each other over time. This simple question helped us maintain that curiosity. Around this period, I also became more intentional about my personal habits. One change involved reducing the amount of negative information I consumed. This does not mean ignoring reality or avoiding important issues. It simply means recognizing that constant exposure to alarming news, endless comparison, and unnecessary negativity can influence emotional well-being. Psychological studies suggest that excessive exposure to negative information can increase stress levels and contribute to anxiety. Once I became more selective about what occupied my attention, I noticed a measurable difference in my mood and energy. The most surprising change, however, involved time. For years, I treated free time as something that happened after everything else was finished. The problem was that everything else was never finished. There was always another task waiting. Another responsibility. Another item on the list. Eventually, I realized that meaningful experiences needed to be scheduled with the same seriousness as obligations. Family walks. Conversations. Shared meals. Quiet moments. These activities were not distractions from life. They were life. This realization changed the way I organized my priorities. One weekend provided a perfect example. Instead of spending the entire day catching up on tasks, we decided to visit a nearby park together. The outing was simple. No expensive activities. No elaborate plans. Yet weeks later, everyone still talked about that day. Not because anything extraordinary happened. It remained memorable because we were fully present. Researchers studying happiness have repeatedly found that experiences often create more lasting satisfaction than material possessions. My family was becoming living proof of that principle. As months passed, the cumulative effect of these small habits became impossible to ignore. Our home felt calmer. Conversations felt easier. Stress became more manageable. Problems still existed, of course. Every family faces challenges. The difference was that we now possessed better tools for navigating them. Instead of waiting for major crises, we were strengthening our relationships through daily choices. The transformation was gradual, which made it easy to underestimate while it was happening. Yet looking back, the results were remarkable. What fascinated me most was that none of these habits required extraordinary talent, wealth, or circumstances. They required consistency, attention, intention. That realization gave me hope because it suggested that meaningful change was accessible to almost anyone willing to begin with small steps. If we were more connected than before, why did so many people around us still seem lonely? I noticed it in conversations, community events, and even among people whose lives appeared successful from the outside. The more I paid attention, the more I realized loneliness was far more common than most people admitted. What I discovered next would reveal one of the most misunderstood aspects of modern life in America, and it would challenge everything I thought I knew about connection, belonging, and happiness. Why loneliness can happen anywhere. Imagine standing in the middle of a crowded room filled with laughter, conversations, music, and smiling faces, yet feeling completely alone. At first, that idea sounds contradictory. Most people assume loneliness happens when someone has no friends, no family, or no social contact. But one of the most surprising lessons I learned while living in America is that loneliness does not always come from being physically alone. I assumed that if people were surrounded by others, loneliness would disappear naturally. The reality turned out to be far more complicated. The first clue appeared during a community event I attended one autumn evening. The room was full. Families chatted around tables. Children played nearby. Conversations flowed easily. On the surface, everything looked warm and welcoming. Several individuals quietly mentioned feeling disconnected despite being constantly surrounded by others. Their circumstances varied dramatically. Some were married. Some were single. Some had large social circles. Others were highly involved in community activities. Yet the emotion they described sounded remarkably similar. They felt unseen. That word stayed with me long after the event ended. Unseen. Not unloved. A parent confessed that balancing responsibilities left little time for meaningful adult friendships. Another person described spending entire days communicating through messages and emails while rarely having genuine conversations. These stories seemed different on the surface, yet they pointed toward the same underlying issue. People were interacting constantly but connecting less deeply than they desired. Modern psychology offers fascinating insights into this phenomenon. Researchers distinguish between social isolation and loneliness. Social isolation refers to having limited social contact. Loneliness, however, refers to the gap between the relationships a person has and the relationships they desire. This distinction explains why someone can feel lonely in a crowd while another person feels content spending time alone. The determining factor is not simply the number of interactions. It is the quality of connection. Once I understood this concept, many experiences began making sense. I remembered times when I had felt disconnected despite being surrounded by people I cared about. I remembered conversations that exchanged information efficiently but rarely explored deeper thoughts or emotions. None of these situations were harmful on their own. Yet together, they revealed how easy it is to confuse communication with connection. She told me about her late husband. They had been married for decades. When people asked about the secret to their relationship, they expected a complicated answer. Instead, she always said the same thing. Over the years, both of them continued asking questions, sharing thoughts, discussing ideas, and exploring each other's experiences. That conversation revealed something profound. Genuine connection requires attention. Not occasional attention. Consistent attention. Relationship researchers frequently support this idea. Studies show that emotional closeness often grows through small moments of responsiveness. People celebrate efficiency, achievement, and constant activity. There is nothing inherently wrong with these values. Problems arise when busyness becomes so dominant that relationships receive only leftover energy. I saw this pattern repeatedly. People cared deeply about friends and family. Yet they postponed meaningful conversations because they felt too busy. Days became weeks. Social scientists have repeatedly found that close relationships are among the strongest predictors of long-term happiness and health. Yet many people unintentionally treat relationships as optional extras rather than essential foundations. This contradiction fascinated me. Human beings often work hard to achieve goals they believe will improve life while neglecting the very relationships most closely linked to. I invited people for coffee. I followed up after conversations. I asked deeper questions. Most importantly, I tried to be fully present during interactions. The results surprised me. Many people seemed grateful for opportunities to have meaningful conversations. It was as if everyone had been waiting for someone else to take the first step. Fear of rejection, uncertainty, or simple habit often keeps them silent. Yet when someone finally reaches out, walls begin to disappear. Over time, I came to view loneliness differently. Rather than seeing it as a personal failure, I began understanding it as a signal. Much like hunger signals a need for food, loneliness signals a need for meaningful connection. Signals are not enemies. They are information. The challenge lies in responding wisely. If connection, relationships, and perspective were so important, What was the single lesson I wished I had learned much earlier? Looking back over my years of marriage, family life, and everyday experiences in America, there were several truths that would have saved me unnecessary stress, confusion, and disappointment. The next chapter of my journey would reveal those lessons, and one of them completely changed the way I understood happiness, success. What I wish someone had told me. If I could sit down with my younger self for just 1 hour, I would not spend that time giving financial advice, predicting future events, or explaining every mistake that was coming. Surprisingly, I would do something much simpler. I would tell her a few truths that took me years to understand. Not because those truths were complicated, but because they were hidden beneath everyday life. The strange thing about wisdom is that it often sounds obvious after you learn it. Before you learn it, however, it can remain completely invisible. Looking back on my years of marriage, family life, friendships, challenges, and personal growth in America, there are several lessons I wish someone had shared with me earlier. These lessons would not have eliminated every difficulty. Life does not work that way. But they would have helped me spend less time worrying about things that mattered very little and more time appreciating things that mattered deeply. The first lesson is this: people are usually carrying more than you can see. This realization changed the way I interact with others. Earlier in life, I often assumed that confident people felt confident all the time. I assumed successful families had fewer struggles. I assumed calm people experienced less stress. Experience taught me otherwise. Again and again, I met individuals whose public image looked effortless while their private reality was filled with challenges. One friend seemed to manage everything perfectly until she shared how overwhelmed she often felt. Another appeared financially secure yet quietly worried about the future every day. A neighbor who always smiled warmly was navigating a difficult family situation nobody knew about. These experiences taught me something powerful. Every person has a story hidden beneath the surface. Psychologists sometimes refer to this as the illusion of transparency. We tend to assume that what we see represents the whole picture. In reality, we are usually seeing only a small fraction. Understanding this made me less judgmental and more compassionate. The second lesson surprised me even more. Happiness is not something that arrives after all problems disappear. For years, I unconsciously believed that happiness existed somewhere in the future. After the next achievement. After the next challenge was solved. After life became more organized, more stable, or more predictable. The problem with this belief is obvious once you notice it. Life never stops presenting new challenges. There is always another responsibility, another goal, another concern waiting around the corner. Researchers studying well-being have consistently found that people who postpone happiness until future conditions improve often remain dissatisfied, even when those conditions eventually arrive. Happiness, it turns out, is less dependent on perfect circumstances than many people assume. This does not mean ignoring difficulties. It means learning to recognize meaningful moments while difficulties still exist. One evening, while cleaning up after dinner, I watched my children laughing together about something completely insignificant. The moment lasted less than a minute. Yet it reminded me of an important truth. Some of life's most valuable experiences happen quietly. They rarely announce themselves as important while they are happening. Another lesson I wish I had learned earlier involves comparison. Modern life provides endless opportunities to compare ourselves with others. Social media, community expectations, professional achievements, parenting styles, financial success, and personal milestones create a constant stream of information. At first glance, comparison seems harmless. Sometimes it can even be motivating. Yet excessive comparison often creates a trap. Instead of measuring progress against our own values, we begin measuring ourselves against carefully selected glimpses of other people's lives. Research repeatedly shows that frequent comparison can reduce satisfaction and increase anxiety. The reason is simple. There will always be someone who appears more successful, more accomplished, or more fortunate. Once comparison becomes a habit, the finish line keeps moving. What changed my perspective was realizing that every person is solving different problems, pursuing different goals, and living under different circumstances. Comparing journeys rarely produces useful information. Understanding this helped me focus more on growth and less on competition. Another lesson concerns relationships. For a long time, I believed strong relationships were built primarily through major moments. Weddings, vacations, celebrations, milestones. Those experiences are meaningful, of course. Yet I eventually discovered that relationships are often shaped more by ordinary days than extraordinary ones. Family researchers frequently emphasize the importance of small interactions. A conversation before bedtime. A supportive comment during a stressful day. A shared meal. A genuine question. These moments may seem insignificant individually. Together, however, they create the emotional foundation of a relationship. Looking back, many of my favorite family memories involve simple moments that no camera captured and no calendar highlighted. The next lesson may be the most important of all. Growth often feels uncomfortable while it is happening. Movies and inspirational stories sometimes portray personal growth as a dramatic breakthrough followed by immediate clarity. Real life is usually messy. Growth often involves confusion, uncertainty, mistakes, and periods when progress feels invisible. There were times when I questioned myself. Times when I felt stuck. Times when I wondered whether my efforts were making any difference. Yet many of those difficult periods later proved to be turning points. Psychologists describe this process as adaptive growth. People often develop resilience, wisdom, and confidence by navigating challenges rather than avoiding them. Understanding this would have saved me countless hours of self-doubt. The final lesson I wish someone had told me earlier is beautifully simple. Life becomes richer when approached with curiosity. Curiosity transforms misunderstandings into opportunities for learning. It transforms differences into sources of insight. It transforms uncertainty into possibility. Many of the most valuable experiences in my life began with a question rather than an answer. Why do people think this way? What can I learn from this situation? How might I view this differently? Curiosity kept doors open that assumptions would have closed. As I reflected on all these lessons, I realized something unexpected. The things that changed my life most were not dramatic achievements or extraordinary events. They were shifts in perspective. Small realizations that gradually altered the way I viewed family, relationships, stress, happiness, and myself. Yet there was still one final question waiting to be answered. The question that had quietly followed me from the very beginning of this journey. Why did living in America feel so different? After everything I had experienced, everything I had learned, and everything my family had overcome together, I was finally ready to understand the answer. And the answer was not what I expected. America felt different, and I grew stronger. What if the biggest mystery in this entire story was never America at all? What if the question that followed me through family dinners, quiet evenings, difficult conversations, parenting challenges, moments of loneliness, and unexpected discoveries had been pointing towards something much closer? For a long time, I believed I was trying to understand a place. I thought I was trying to understand a culture, a lifestyle, a way of living that often felt different from what I expected. And in many ways, that was true. America did feel different. The social rules were different. The pace of life was different. The expectations surrounding independence, personal space, communication, family dynamics, and success often felt different. Yet after years of experiences, observations, mistakes, lessons, and growth, I finally realized something that changed everything. The greatest difference was not happening around me. It was happening within me. Looking back now, I can clearly see the woman who appeared at the beginning of this story. She was trying her best to build a meaningful life. She loved her family deeply. She wanted strong relationships, a happy marriage, and a peaceful home. Yet she carried assumptions she did not recognize. She believed understanding would arrive automatically. She believed connection would maintain itself without intentional effort. She believed happiness would eventually appear after enough problems were solved. Most importantly, she believed many of her frustrations were caused by external circumstances. The years that followed gently challenged every one of those beliefs. One of the most important lessons came through marriage. I learned that love is not a destination people reach once and then permanently possess. Love is a practice. It is built through listening, curiosity, patience, honesty, forgiveness, and daily choices. Research on long-term relationships consistently supports this idea. Strong marriages are not created because two people avoid difficulties. They are created because two people repeatedly choose connection when difficulties appear. My husband and I certainly faced misunderstandings. We experienced stress, exhaustion, and moments when communication became difficult. Yet those experiences taught us something valuable. Relationships grow stronger when people stop trying to win and start trying to understand. That lesson alone transformed our family more than any perfect circumstance ever could. Raising children provided another unexpected source of wisdom. I once thought parenting was mainly about teaching. Over time, I discovered it was equally about learning. My children taught me to pay attention to simple moments. They reminded me that curiosity is powerful, that joy often hides in ordinary experiences, and that people do not need perfect lives to feel grateful. Studies in developmental psychology frequently emphasize the importance of emotional connection in family life. Looking back, I realize those principles were unfolding in front of me every day. The strongest memories were rarely connected to major achievements. They were connected to shared experiences, conversations, laughter, and time spent together. Then there was the lesson of loneliness, perhaps one of the most surprising discoveries in this journey. At first, loneliness seemed like something that happened only when people lacked relationships. Reality proved otherwise. I learned that connection is not measured by the number of people around us. It is measured by the depth of understanding between us. This realization changed how I approached friendships, family interactions, and even casual conversations. Instead of waiting for connection to happen automatically, I learned to participate in creating it. A simple invitation. A thoughtful question. A few extra minutes of attention. These small actions often carried more power than I ever expected. Another lesson emerged from the hidden pressures of daily life. Modern life often encourages people to move faster, achieve more, and stay constantly productive. There is value in ambition and responsibility, but I learned that busyness can quietly become a substitute for meaning. Psychological research repeatedly shows that well-being is strongly connected to relationships, purpose, gratitude, and emotional health. Yet many people spend years chasing outcomes while neglecting the foundations that make those outcomes meaningful. I was not immune to this pattern. There were seasons when I became so focused on responsibilities that I nearly overlooked the life I was working so hard to support. Thankfully, experience taught me to notice the difference. One of the most profound discoveries involved perspective itself. Earlier in this story, I described the moment I learned about negativity bias and how attention shapes experience. That lesson remained with me because it influenced nearly every other lesson that followed. Life contains challenges. No amount of optimism changes that reality. Families face stress. Relationships encounter difficulties. Plans fail. Mistakes happen. Yet the human mind possesses an extraordinary ability to influence how those experiences are interpreted. Positive psychology researchers often describe resilience as the ability to adapt constructively to challenges. In practical terms, resilience is not about pretending difficulties do not exist. It is about refusing to let difficulties define the entire story. That perspective helped me appreciate something important about living in America. The differences I noticed were real, but differences are not automatically obstacles. Often they are invitations to learn, adapt, and grow. By the time I understood this, the original question sounded very different in my mind. Why did living in America feel so different? The answer was no longer about neighborhoods, customs, schedules, or social expectations. The answer involved growth. Living here challenged assumptions I did not know I had. It exposed weaknesses in my thinking. It revealed strengths I had not fully recognized. It taught me patience, curiosity, empathy, and gratitude. In many ways, America felt different because it became the setting where I changed. And perhaps that is the real message of this entire journey. Sometimes the experiences that feel unfamiliar, uncomfortable, or confusing are not interrupting our growth. They are creating it. The challenges we resist may contain lessons we need. The questions that refuse to disappear may be guiding us toward deeper understanding. And the life we are searching for may already be unfolding inside ordinary moments we have not fully noticed yet. If there is one thought I hope stays with you after this story ends, it is this: growth rarely announces itself while it is happening. Often it appears disguised as a difficult conversation, a stressful season, a confusing situation, or a question without an immediate answer. Yet years later, those moments become the chapters that shaped us most. America felt different. Life felt different. But in the end, the greatest transformation was not the world around me. The greatest transformation was learning how to see it more clearly. Before you leave, I want to ask you one simple question. What if the thing that feels hardest in your life right now is not the end of your story, but the beginning of a chapter you have not understood yet? For years, I thought the biggest challenge was learning how to live in a different environment. I thought the answers were hidden somewhere outside of me. But the longer I lived, loved, struggled, made mistakes, and kept moving forward, the more I realized something unexpected. The world did not change first. I did. And maybe that is why this story matters. Because somewhere tonight, someone is listening to this video while feeling tired, discouraged, lonely, misunderstood, or uncertain about the future. Maybe you are trying to improve your English. Maybe you are rebuilding a relationship. Maybe you are carrying a burden nobody else can see. If that is you, remember this. A better life is rarely built in one dramatic moment. It is built in small conversations, small choices, small acts of courage, small steps repeated day after day. One day, you look back and realize those tiny steps carried you farther than you ever imagined. And here is the thought that still stays with me. The most important journey is not crossing an ocean, moving to another country, finding the perfect job, or chasing the perfect life. The most important journey is becoming the person you were meant to be while living the life you already have. But this raises another question. What story is waiting to change your life next? Perhaps it will begin in the next video. Perhaps it will begin tomorrow. Or perhaps it has already begun, and you simply have not recognized it yet. If this story touched your heart, helped your English listening practice, or reminded you that you are not alone in your struggles, please take a moment to support the channel. Like this video. Leave a comment and tell me, what is one lesson life has taught you recently? Subscribe and turn on notifications because every week we share slow English stories, real-life American culture, love and family stories, and English listening practice designed to inspire, relax, and help you improve naturally. Thank you for spending your time here. And remember, sometimes the chapter that feels confusing today becomes the story you are proud to tell tomorrow. See you in the next story.